He ruled half the world, but couldn't spend a single night alone. Every evening at court ended the same way, the queen in tears, the king moaning, and a sound behind velvet curtains that palace guards would never forget, because once the bedroom doors closed, no one left, not even her. Philip V of Spain was more than a king. He was a man consumed by grief, by madness, by an obsession so intense it turned his wife into a prisoner and the royal bed into a cage. This is not the history they teach in school. There are no statues for what happened in that room, only whispers, only warnings, of a man who screamed when the queen tried to leave his side, who couldn't sleep unless he was touching her, who once made her stay in bed so long, her skin began to rot. He was called His Most Catholic Majesty, but behind closed doors, he was the most perverted king in Spain's history. But how does a king end up like this? To understand Philip's obsession, you have to go back, long before the screams, long before the rot, to a boy who was never meant to wear a crown. They called him the Silent Bourbon. Born into the French royal family in 1683, Philip was quiet, withdrawn, even as a child. He avoided touch, eye contact, emotion. He would stare at the wall for hours, unmoving. Sometimes, servants had to physically shake him to make sure he was alive. His tutors wrote that he seemed absent from the world. He rarely spoke, never smiled, and he didn't seem to care about anything, except for one thing: his mother, Maria Anna of Bavaria. She was the only one who could reach him, the only person he clung to, and when she died suddenly of tuberculosis, Philip didn't cry. He simply stopped talking altogether. Some historians now believe he had early signs of mental illness. Others think it was unresolved childhood trauma, but whatever it was, it followed him into adulthood, because when his older relatives died unexpectedly, the quiet boy from Versailles was suddenly thrust into power. At just 17 years old, he was crowned King of Spain. He didn't speak the language. He had no military experience. He barely showed emotion during the coronation. But when he looked at the Spanish court, foreign, cold, unfamiliar, he turned to the one thing that had once made him feel safe: a woman. They married in 1701. He was 17, she was 13. Maria Louisa of Savoy, chosen for political reasons like most queens. But to Philip, she became everything. At first it seemed innocent, sweet, even. He sat beside her at meals, escorted her everywhere, listened to her voice like it was scripture. But soon it became something darker. He began refusing to eat unless she fed him. He wouldn't meet with ministers unless she sat beside him, and he couldn't sleep unless her body was touching his. One advisor said, "The queen is no longer a consort, she is a shadow, a nurse, a prisoner." Because Philip didn't just want her company, he required it, constantly, in sickness, in health, in sleep, in prayer, in silence. When she needed space, he panicked. When she cried, he trembled, and if she ever tried to leave the room, he would scream, not like a man, like a child, panicked, unhinged, animal. At first the palace covered for him. They said the king was sensitive, passionate, but it became harder to ignore when he stopped ruling altogether. Ministers stood outside his bedroom door for hours, waiting for royal decisions that never came, because the king was in bed, stroking the queen's hair, murmuring nonsense, refusing to let her move. The servants called it the hour of dread. Every night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, they would hear him, screaming, moaning, whimpering. Not the sounds of a man in pain, but something worse: obsession. From behind the thick velvet drapes of the royal bedchamber, they could hear the queen sobbing, sometimes praying, sometimes begging, and still, he would not let her go. The guards on duty would glance at each other, pale-faced, but they never intervened. Because to interrupt King Philip V of Spain in his pleasure was to risk execution. What happened behind those doors was never recorded in official history. No textbook tells you. No royal biographer dares mention it. But the truth was whispered in hallways, carved into servant journals, and preserved in the trembling voices of courtiers who outlived him. They said he couldn't sleep without touching her, that he refused to leave the bed for days, sometimes weeks, that the queen, barely 20 years old, was not allowed to move without his permission. And when she tried to escape the bed for even a moment, he would scream, not just shout, not just call her name, scream like a man being murdered. And so she stayed, through illness, through blood, through rot, through absolute humiliation. Because if she didn't, he might lose his mind. By her early 20s, Maria Luisa was deteriorating. She had lost weight. She rarely smiled. Her voice, once bright and musical, became strained, like she was speaking through exhaustion. But she wasn't sick with fever, or plague, or poison. She was sick from being loved, because Philip wouldn't let her rest, wouldn't let her leave the room, wouldn't let her walk through a garden, or spend a day away, or even sleep without his body pressed against hers. Ministers begged him to return to his duties. He refused. He said, "What good is Spain without her?" Court life fell apart. Council meetings were cancelled. All decisions passed through the Queen. War strategies, tax reforms, ambassador requests. She handled it all, from the side of a royal bed, soaked in sweat and perfume. Some began calling her the Phantom Queen, because no one saw her anymore. Only her voice, her orders, her written commands, signed with a hand that trembled from exhaustion. In 1714, her body finally gave up. After a brief illness, made worse by years of emotional captivity, Maria Luisa died. She was 25 years old, and when she passed, Philip shattered, not metaphorically, physically. He collapsed beside her body and refused to move. He screamed, he wept, he pounded his fists against the floor, then he stopped speaking altogether. For 3 weeks, he didn't eat, he didn't bathe, he didn't acknowledge anyone. He simply lay there, next to her cold body, waiting to die. Spain had no ruler, just a bedroom, a corpse, and a king who had no reason to live. They said the king was broken. He spoke in whispers, walked like an old man, refused sunlight, refused food, refused the world. But what terrified the court was how long it lasted. Months. He stopped attending mass. He stopped seeing ministers. He stared at the wall for hours, unblinking. When advisors finally begged him to remarry, to stabilize the monarchy, he laughed, not politely, not softly, hysterically. Then he said something that chilled the room. "She is not dead. You don't understand. She is only hiding." For a moment they thought he meant it spiritually, but then, he gave an order. He commanded his agents to find a woman who looked exactly like Maria Luisa. Same age, same height, same eyes, same voice, and they did. Her name was Elizabeth Farnese, a noble woman from Parma, intelligent, controlled, beautiful in a way that mimicked the Queen, just enough to fool a grieving mind. In December 1714, just months after Maria's death, Philip married her, but not out of love, out of obsession. He dressed her in his first wife's gowns, ordered her to sleep in the same bed, wear the same perfume, speak the same phrases. The courtiers whispered behind gloved hands, "He hasn't remarried, he's replaced her." And they weren't wrong, because what began as grief was transforming into something far more disturbing. At first Elizabeth Farnese tolerated it. She played the part, smiled, performed. She understood that marrying a king, especially one in mourning, came with expectations. But then the expectations became commands, and the commands became rules. She was told not to walk without permission, not to leave the room unless escorted, not to raise her voice, not to cry. She was expected to stay in bed with him, not just at night, but during the day, for hours, sometimes days. Philip refused to start his morning unless she opened her eyes first, refused to eat unless she chewed beside him, refused to speak unless she replied. One servant wrote, "The Queen does not live as a woman, she lives as a mirror." And Philip, he was slipping. His sleep became erratic. He would wake screaming from nightmares of Maria Luisa rotting in her tomb. He'd stare into the fire and mutter prayers for hours, then laugh without warning, then sob. He stopped wearing royal clothes, started dressing like a monk, shaved his head, refused to cut his fingernails. Ministers tried to keep the truth contained, but by now it was impossible. Spain wasn't being ruled, it was being haunted. The court had a king in name, but what they really had was a man possessed by grief, possessed by lust, possessed by memory, possessed by his dead wife. And the worst was still coming, because this wasn't the bottom of Philip's madness, this was just the descent. By 1724, the king's behavior could no longer be spun. There were no courtiers left who believed he was fit to rule, no noble who still clung to the illusion that this was just a phase. Because Philip V had stopped pretending. He wouldn't attend meetings, wouldn't sign documents, wouldn't speak to ministers without his wife beside him, whispering each line. If she was absent, even for a moment, he refused to function. And so, he abdicated. He handed the throne to his son Louis I, a bright young man, barely 17, who had been raised in the shadow of a rotting monarchy. For a brief moment, the court breathed again. The spell was broken. Philip retired to a smaller palace, surrounded by music, incense and silence. He stayed in bed all day, wrapped in heavy curtains, convinced that darkness protected his soul. But the peace didn't last. Because just 7 months into his reign, the new king Louis I fell violently ill. Smallpox. He died in agony at 17, and Philip, instead of mourning, he smiled. He said, "God has returned the crown to its rightful head." And just like that, he took the throne back, a king reborn, but not restored. Because this version of Philip was worse. He was paranoid, cruel, frightened by mirrors, terrified of sudden noises, convinced that demons whispered to him through the fireplace, and Elizabeth, his second wife, was now his keeper. She controlled the court through pillows and candlelight, filtered every message, every decree, every interaction. The palace became a locked room, with velvet curtains, and Spain became a ghost kingdom. By the 1730s, Philip V of Spain no longer resembled a king. He rarely dressed. He refused shoes. He wore only sackcloth robes, convinced they protected him from sin. He slept in filth, refused to cut his hair, refused to trim his nails, refused to be seen in daylight. He believed shadows whispered secrets, that mirrors could trap souls, that if he stared at the sun too long, he would die and be reborn. He no longer spoke in complete sentences. He would babble, stutter, repeat the same prayers for hours. Sometimes he would scream, claw at the walls, curse invisible demons. Other times he'd weep quietly, rocking in bed, begging for Maria Luisa to return. The royal guards stopped patrolling. No one visited. Ambassadors wrote that Spain had become a nation ruled by a ghost. And still, Elizabeth stayed. She remained in the room, sat by his bed, held his trembling hands, spoke to him in the voice of the first queen, the only voice he truly heard. And then finally, on July 9th, 1746, at 4:15 in the morning, Philip V died. Not in glory, not in majesty, not even in peace. He died tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, clawing at the air, muttering Maria Luisa's name. There was no great funeral, no thunderous procession, just silence, and the whispered relief of a nation that had waited 40 years to breathe again. History remembers Philip V as a king, but behind the crown was something else. A man undone by grief, a lover who became a jailer, a monarch who ruled not with power, but with obsession. This wasn't politics. This was possession, and the scars he left on Spain weren't carved in stone. They were carved in whispers, in silence, in locked doors, scented candles, and servants who pretended not to hear the screams. If this is the kind of royal history you were never taught in school, subscribe to Shrouded History for more stories the textbooks tried to bury, and tell me in the comments what other forgotten rulers deserve to be unearthed.